Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Hogothinga podcast. I'm Cora Anthony, the Training and Development Specialist here at the Native Learning Center. I am super excited about today's episode. We have some repeat offenders joining us. I think this is the third time that they're with us. I'm very excited to sit down and speak with them again. So today on the show, we have Dr. Cynthia Annett, a research associate professor at KSU and data and mapping maven, who is also a Google Earth Outreach Network trainer. Cynthia, go ahead and say hi to everybody.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here.
We also have Eugene Golfer, an adjunct professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, who retired after 30 years with HUD and has been a longtime NLC instructor. And we absolutely adore him. Eugene, go ahead and say hello to everybody.
Hello, everyone. It's a beautiful day.
And last but definitely not least, the star of today's episode, Mark Juncker. He's a tribal response coordinator for the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska, and who is also active in many national tribal environmental initiatives. Mark, go ahead and say hello to everybody.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So today we will be discussing brownfield programs in tribal communities. And I want to just jump right in. And Mark, I'm going to nitpick on you a little bit. So Mark, as the tribal response coordinator for the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska, can you explain to our listeners what is tribal response and what are brownfields?
Oh, well, thank you. That's one of the questions that it's a question I get an awful lot, and it's one that's difficult to answer quite often because it's your understanding of what I actually do is going to be really dependent on how much experience you've had with brownfields. And when I say I'm a tribal response coordinator, people will, if they're interested, they'll look at me and say, "What?" And then I'll go into a little bit of detail of what I do. But the program was set up to help the tribes administer brownfields. And brownfields are properties that aren't being used in the community because people think they're contaminated with pollutants or hazardous materials. And so what a tribal response program is going to do is give the tribes the capacity to find out where those properties are, assess them, clean them up if need be, and then the real cool part is they'll begin to reuse them. But in the meantime, we can get all kinds of calls. When they say response, it could be anything from a dead raccoon in the road that needs cleaned up to a spill at the gas station. So the range of calls that I get is pretty diverse.
And it's sort of interesting that on one hand, there's a logical connection between you clean up this property that's contaminated and then you want to bring it back to the community. On the other hand, a lot of brownfields are just stuck properties that aren't contaminated, but people think they might be contaminated and they're unwilling to spend the money to investigate to see if they're contaminated, to do something about it. So Mark has an interesting role here, which sometimes he's dealing with really dangerous situations and we have to protect health and safety as soon as possible. And then on the other hand, he has properties that could have been sitting for 10 or 20 years with nothing happening. And it's up to him to figure out how to turn this around, how to get it with some type of where it's a plus for the community in the neighborhood rather than a negative.
So I have a question. So if it's a situation like that where it's like a stuck property, Eugene, like you mentioned, like it's just been there, and then after they reassess it and it's not really contaminated or whatnot, then what happens then? Like, is it like, what's the word that I'm looking for? Like, can they rehabilitate it and like use it for a living or create like a park or something like that? Or what happens to those type of properties?
I'll take the lead, but Mark will follow up. But that's sort of what we're doing with this podcast series, that it's not easy to get these stuff properties and put them back. And we're going to, each of this podcast series, we're going to try and go over a different one of the steps that you have to take, and you have to take lots of steps. The main thing I'd emphasize quickly in response to your question is it's really up to the community to figure out what they want on that property and what's feasible. Is it feasible to think that the private sector is going to build a little store there and that way we'll get money? Or do we think that, the private sector is not going to be interested in this property? So could the tribe build a police station here, or some type of tribal facility, or maybe make it into a park? And one of the things we do with TAB is we help facilitate visioning sessions where the community gets together and says, hey, what would we like to see at this property? And we're going to talk about that specifically at a future podcast. Mark, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, the community goals are really important with what happens to those stuck properties. We've had several, and the vision was to use them in our domestic violence program as offices, as shelters. And so cleaning up those properties was important for those programs. We were able to work together with them to accomplish some things. And sometimes we fall short of our goals. At the very least, what we wound up with was some decent green space. A yard that, we've got to mow during the summer, but other than that, there's really, it's better than a dilapidated house that really didn't have much of a future because of all the asbestos around.
And we're taking the long view that sometimes we talk about an interim land use, like let's have a community garden here. As the perception of this property goes from negative, who'd want to be here, to, oh, this is a real big part of our neighborhood, and then maybe we can bring in private sector money that will have the money to really redevelop this site. I want to foreshadow our next episode that an important part of all this is getting data to figure out, what's the reality and what's possible. And Cynthia is our data guru.
No, thank you guys for that, because I've always wondered, right? And I'm very new to Brownfields and this. I'm learning so much every time we record a different episode. But yeah, like, how do you change the perception? So I think, yeah, the idea of like a community garden, or like like not a compost but where you grow like your own food and things like that. Like, it's like you can bring the kids. I know here when I was teaching in Big Cypress, we had something of the sort where the kids would grow their own things and whatnot. So kind of reimagining those spaces, that would be kind of cool. Thank you for sharing that. So Mark, I'm gonna pound on you again. So can you share with us, how was this program set up and how long has it been up and running?
Okay, the program had its roots in about 2008 as part of the Sac and Fox Environmental Program. We have 3 departments here. We have our GAP, which is our General Assistance Program. We have our Surface Water Program. And then we have the Brownfields. We used to have air as well. We no longer have that program, but may go about getting that back in the future. But the Brownfields program was set up under the GAP program to look at some of the various properties. And when it was first set up, they were busy. They had 5 different cleanups they did on 10 different properties that were assessed.
Let me also point out, like, most of our audience today is like tribal housing authorities, tribally designated housing entities, and Mark's he gets his funding from EPA, and the housing authorities get their funding from HUD. HUD is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So on one hand, when you think about a brownfield, that's a piece of property that's dilapidated and stuck, and how do you rejuvenate it? You would think that belongs on the HUD side with the HUD funding. For various reasons we're not going to get into today, it really EPA picked up the ball and ran with it because EPA was being blamed by everyone. How come we can't get these properties? They're just sitting there. So, and HUD had this, we give money and it's up to the locals to decide what to do with it. So EPA said, we need some leadership here. We got to get involved. So when Mark mentioned GAP, that's a major program source of revenue for tribes through EPA to look at the environment, and that was going long before we even thought of doing brownfields on tribal land.
And so many of these programs are a little bit artificial because, of course, the community is going to see things in a more holistic fashion. They're going to see, oh, there's a smokestack that is causing asthma, and there's a stuck property, and our water's not drinkable. And they're going to see that as a package. They're not going to see them as individual media. And so one of the things that we do at Tribal Tab is to try to help them figure out, this is the agency that takes care of that. This is the agency that takes care of that. And you pull them all together so you have several different partners to get things moving forward.
And that is one of our subtexts of this whole podcast series is we think there are a lot of benefits of tribal response programs and tribal housing authorities working together, and they have worked together. And that's one of the things we're going to try and showcase in our podcast series is examples of tribal housing authorities and tribal response programs helping each other out and helping the tribe out. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, and the thing about the tribal response program that is really kind of unique is, especially with an EPA, and I don't know, maybe to a certain extent in HUD as well, people have gotten put in silos and they become very expert in a certain subject or a certain media, and they're really, really good at what they do, but what they're not really good at is figuring out who needs their services, how can people take advantage of it, and that's one of the things that the Brownfields program has allowed me to do is kind of step out of the box of specific media and try and connect people with the expertise they need to get a property unstuck.
And that's one of the things we emphasize that, what do they say? It takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes a village and more so to redevelop a brownfield. And we when we talked about that visioning sessions that we help out with TAB, we talk about getting all the stakeholders involved and talking together and saying, what can we do together? How can we work together to change, to improve a situation?
So would it be safe to say that you guys are kind of like the liaison to help get the people to the right sources and the right connections?
Yes and no. Like no one size fits all. I'll say that and turn it over to Mark.
Yeah, sometimes the word liaison may lend itself to someone who really doesn't have a dog in the fight. They're just like trying to put groups together. I like to think that I very much have a dog in the fight, and so I am concerned and interested in the outcomes, whether it's directly involving my tribe, my department. I think we all like to see progress being made, and in the case of the Sac and Fox Emergency Response or Tribal Response Program.
Can you repeat that, Mark? Because it kind of faded out, or was it?
I'm sorry about that. I'm kind of losing my voice a little bit this morning.
Oh no.
But yeah, we really have the belief that there's good things that we can accomplish, and we'd like to see them done right. With the
and
involved.
Mark speaking as a travel response coordinator for his tribe is definitely a person who is really good at pulling people in that need to be in the discussion. And what we do as Tribal Tab for our technical assistance is we might make suggestions. We're always in the assistance role. And one of the things that we can assist with is different techniques for community engagement or helping to connect a TRP person like Mark to the person in the agency that could answer questions or should be at the table. But the Tribal Tab that isn't actually the person that does the liaison. We do the technical assistance to the people who would be the liaison.
Okay,
and while we're talking about, I'm sorry, while we're talking about how we could help, We also help tribes get money in that, especially with the EPA grants. We have tools on our website to help you write put together an application. We'll review the application for you. We'll cover that at some point in the future.
No, thank you for that. Because like I said, I'm very new to all this. I'm trying to make sense of it all. So you kind of steered me in the right direction. So please do share. So all of this help that you're providing and whatnot, can you share some of the types of responses that you have participated in?
Well, and there are many different aspects to that. I think some of the the best ones involve the phase one that we did on some houses. Again, done maybe not in the order it should have been done, but we were able to confirm that a property was clean. It's now the site of a community garden and domestic violence offices, and it's a property where we're going to host Earth Day events this year. I just got confirmed on a group of first graders who are going to come out and help with our community garden, and so we're really excited about that. But there's some other ones that were, way more interesting when we talk about a train derailment. We oversaw the cleanup of that, which was a huge mess. We had 13 rail cars go off the tracks right behind our tribal council offices here in Reserve. And
what
so,
type of substances were there?
we didn't know for a while, and that was the scary part about it. We didn't know whether we'd have to evacuate or not, but it turned out to be just cottonseed oil, and none of the containers actually burst. We wound up only putting about 50 gallons of cottonseed oil into a soybean field. The train did have things like chlorine gas on it, so we were fortunate that the 13 cars that did go off the tracks were the ones that did. We wound up getting a couple rail cars full of 2x4s out of it too. So all in all, it was an extremely interesting cleanup.
What about the dead raccoons?
The dead raccoons are not all that frequent, but every once in a while you do get some strange calls. And when they call about those, that's generally a county job to take care of those. And if I'm in the neighborhood, I can usually get rid of it and put it in a safe place for a buzzard to take care
I'm
of.
sure that's what happens to all our listeners. You do a good job. People know they can count on you, and they figure they'll call you no matter what their problem is.
Oh my God. No, I'm laughing because when I used to drive up to Big Cypress, we didn't have raccoons, but I would see dead snakes on Snake Road at all times. So it's like, listen, I gotta call Mark over here. Come pick up from the side of the road. So what about brownfields? Can you share any stories about some of the brownfields you've worked in?
Most of the brownfields that I have specific experience with are more like documenting the cleanup and making sure that this site is no longer any threat. So it's a lot of looking through various reports and making sure that when we upload our data to EPA and their acres database, which is the record of all the properties where EPA has recognized as potentially hazardous or allocated money towards, and this is publicly available. I'm making sure that those sites have all been, cleaned up. They have no further action designated by the tribal council, and including all the documentation for that.
Let me also add a little thing on perspective. Like, brownfields started in the 90s, the brownfields programs unofficially, and then they passed the law in I think 2002, and most of the impetus for all this came from urban areas. That it was actually the National Conference for Mayors was complaining to EPA in the 80s, and we discussed that with liability last time, that they couldn't get investors. They couldn't get banks to lend on properties. So that's why they did all this. But most tribes are in rural areas, and rural areas are different than urban areas. They are. And there's a lot more activity, transactions, economic activity happening in urban areas than rural areas. So what I'm trying to get at is it's even as challenging as it is to redevelop a brownfield in an urban area. It's generally even more challenging in a rural area.
Right. In our most recent targeted brownfields assessment was done on some housing, some tribal housing, where we had considerable meth use and potentially some meth manufacturing going on. And so those houses were, we were really worried about, throwing kids into those houses without a good assessment. And so EPA did come in, they thoroughly tested all those houses, and it turns out they're fine. The problem is the people that had lived there weren't exactly the greatest homemakers. So there is quite a bit of damage to the house. The cleanup isn't going to be a hazardous materials cleanup, but there's still a cleanup involved.
Yeah, and let me also point out to our listeners, there are a bunch of instances, examples where tribal housing authorities have worked with the tribal response programs on meth cleanups. And for just those listeners who have that problem and haven't connected with the tribal response programs, that's what I would do right away. I'd get in contact with them and say, could you help me with this meth cleanup problem? If you haven't done that already, I'm sure most of our listeners who have that problem have done that. But even if we help one person, it'd be worth it.
Definitely, definitely. And can you guys share with me, how has the role of TRP evolved over time?
Well, that's something that's kind of dependent on each response program's capacity and each response program's unique situation. Like for me, there's not just a plethora of properties out there that this demands my attention. I need to get there, and then here's the next one coming right down the pipe. And I know some response programs where they literally have brownfields properties almost on a conveyor belt. And I'm thinking some of the larger reservations in the Dakotas where they're just like these incredibly efficient cleanup programs that are using every single dollar that comes to them, and they're really, kind of like my idols up there. Some of those larger reservations like Flandreau and Standing Rock, and our program has evolved in such a way that we were helping out our truck stop and trading post with underground storage tanks issues. That's been a huge component of our program right now, is making sure that they're compliant and for all their inspections. We're also dealing with a leaking underground storage tank and trying to make sure that's cleaned up in the right way and signed off on, because EPA is the regulating authority for us since it is on reservation land. The other aspect where I've gotten extremely involved in is with climate change and how that's going to impact cleanups, making sure that we're not expending more energy and creating more greenhouse gases cleaning up a place than we would just leaving it in spots. So trying to be more efficient in the work that we do on the reservation and elsewhere. We've put together some mitigation plans so that flooding and windstorms, which we've had both numerous times in the past 3 years, that we can respond to those events better, installing generators on some of the buildings. So my role has really grown, just so I have work to do. Basically, I like to be busy. I like to be connected. I like to know what's going on. And all these aspects I'm able to incorporate into the work plan of my 128A program.
I like to add
And one of
something.
the
You first, Cynthia.
Okay, and one of the things that we've seen happen, depending on, like Mark said, the size of the reservation, the number of special problems they have, the capacity of the staff. What we have seen is a number of tribes develop specialties that can then be used by other tribes. So there's a lot of cooperation going on right now. Let's say that one of our upper Midwest or Great Plains tribes is dealing with oil and gas fields and man camps. They may, like Mark said, they may have so many brownfields properties to deal with that they develop cleanup teams that then spin off into tribally owned companies, and have the capacity to be the consultants for other tribes. We've also seen, I've seen this with drone programs, UAS programs, where one tribe might develop capacity where they have drone pilots. I know of one tribe where some of their tribal members are former Air Force drone pilots, and they develop a program that then can be consultants for other tribes. So we are seeing TRP programs expand out so that they can be regional resources for other tribes.
I want to add another perspective that we talked about. The Brownfields program started in the 90s and the law was passed in 2002. And when it first started, there really wasn't as much of a role for tribes. And a lot of federal programs are that way. The way the tribes' roles, the tribes' responsibilities have expanded. Now, if you're in a rural area, you generally rely on the state. If you're in a city, you rely on your city government to do your responses and redevelop brownfields. If you're not a tribe and you're in a rural area, your community is probably too small and you rely on the state, and their priorities are different. Population means a lot, how many people are doing it. And I think one important point to get across is that the tribal response programs were created because there was a need, that the tribe's needs weren't being met by the state. Not that there was anything nefarious involved, but just in terms of, where the numbers are. And tribes, part of self-determination, felt that we should exert control. We should have the relationship with EPA, right? Like the states have the relationship with EPA and then they deal with their population. Well, the tribes should be dealing directly with EPA so we could promote our goals and objectives.
And I actually heard that the first tribal cleanup was a Seminole program. It was on a Seminole property, is what I heard. And I need to find out more about that, but I was told that the first cleanup was a Seminole property.
Oh, I did not know that. I think I agree with you, Eugene, in terms of, even though I'm not Native, but I do work for Native communities, I find it so beautiful when tribes kind of take it upon themselves, like, you guys are not helping us, we're going to help ourselves. So it's really like these type of programs I think are so cool because it's who knows the area better than the Native community and the people that live in it and that drive by it every day and that live in those premises. They are the ones that need to have the control and how are we going to clean it up? What are we going to repurpose it for? Like, I get really excited because I'm like, yes, this is your land. You have to do with it what you know is best instead of having someone else come in and tell you this is what we're going to do with it. So that concept of self-determination and it just it makes me excited. It really does. It might. Like I was saying at the beginning before we started recording, I geek out on all this. So you guys see me here like, oh my God, yes, and like nodding. And I'm taking it all in. So thank you guys for sharing that.
And that also gets into one of the main reasons we're doing this is that tribes should be doing it, but gee, we're such a small tribe. Do we have the expertise? Can we do it? And that's why we're trying to get the word out that number one, there's TAB, Technical Assistance for Brownfield, free technical assistance funded by EPA. Number two is, as Mark's pointing out, there's all these networks of where the tribal response coordinators, where the people involved in the field are talking to each other and sharing knowledge.
No, I got super excited when Cynthia mentioned that they're trying to like expand and kind of become their own, because I don't know, I just feel like I know how I'm Hispanic, so I know how Hispanics are. We like to keep it kind of in-house, and I trust more an expert that knows my cultural background, that understands who I am, to give me advice on what to do. I was thinking, like, I was imagining as Cynthia was speaking, and I'm like, how cool that it's like tribes helping tribes, like we understand the problems that we've had, we understand the culture, we understand the different ways that we work with each other, and they're so respectful of that. That it just sounds so beautiful to me. So no, I get really excited when we talk about all this. So, and I mean, my next question to you guys, and we've kind of touched about this a little bit here and there, but can you guys share with us other Indian housing authorities that are working with TRPs that you guys know of?
I'm not sure specifically how which housing authorities are most active in the Brownfield program. I know the experience that I've had is when we have these kind of large gatherings of response programs, there's always a housing and urban development voice on the agenda. But because of our location, that voice is in Denver, Colorado, and they'll often like, oh, well, we can't make it. They'll schedule someone to come in from Omaha who really isn't an expert on this. And so there's a big disconnect. And so some real, I guess what I want to call like, prize winning stories about the great interaction between HUD and TRP. I don't have one at my fingertips right now.
I have one example. I did a little work with the Northern Ponca Housing Authority. I think it was like right at the beginning of COVID or right before, and they were working with their TRP coordinator because they were acquiring sites for developing new housing. The Northern Ponca, they're a relatively new housing authority, and they allow any Native American to go in their housing. Okay, so they were in an urban area. I think it was even in Omaha, and they were acquiring like for a 12 unit or a 20 unit, a substantial project, but not a huge project. And with the HUD rules, if it's more than single family, you have to do a phase 1 environmental site assessment. So on one hand, they could have hired out to there's people all over the country doing these phase 1s, but instead they went to their tribal response program and they said, could you do the phase 1 for them? And number one, this was good because it was somebody from the tribe who was trying to further the tribe's objectives. And another interesting thing about this was the person who, the tribal response program for the Ponca tribe is not a huge tribe. And in order to do a phase 1, you have to be a qualified environmental professional. You have to have 10 years experience. And if you're a qualified environmental professional, you can make a lot of money doing phase 1s and phase 2s all over the place. Why would you take a job as a tribal response professional? But I'm not sure of the details, but they had this worked out where the engineer who was working for the tribe did most of the phase 1, but they had over their shoulders somebody who did work for the tribe looking at the phase 1 and signing. I think they signed, I hope I'm not messing up the details, but it was more like a collaboration, and people made it work.
Yeah,
well, there's a couple.
I'm familiar with that, and yeah, they did their phase 1, and even though they didn't have that 10 years experience, they would take their work to a person that did have that experience, and he signed off on it for them, and it wound up saving them quite a bit of money.
And one of the really important things about that, I'm sorry, I have a dog barking in the background. Hopefully she'll stop.
Can't you train your dog?
There must be a coyote.
Don't worry,
around.
No, there's a coyote out in the field.
Lewis can cut it out, so don't worry.
Thank you, Lewis.
Sorry. So one of the there's a couple of really important things about this case study is one that Mark was talking about where there was a collaboration. Many tribes can get that certification by having someone work with their TRP coordinator or someone else in the tribe to do those in-field certifications. They have to have a certain amount of time and a certain amount of experience. They can get that experience in these collaborations and build that capacity, which is, of course, part of tribal sovereignty. But another point that Eugene mentioned I want to follow up on is that we have urban Indian populations like in Kansas City that are very large, and they're not on a reservation. And in some cases, they may not have enough citizens of any given tribe to trigger resources. But oftentimes, like in Kansas City or in Wichita here in Kansas, we have wonderful Indian centers and a very rich and large urban Indian population. And where they can reach out to tribal professionals and they can bring in nearby reservations where we may have someone wonderful like Mark, or somebody nearby. They can be involved in those redevelopment schemes and actually serve their urban population better than, say, the municipal or county or state programs could. So that collaboration between an urban Indian population wanting to develop housing in an urban setting and nearby tribal professionals who are actually qualified to do that work for them and maybe more responsive to certain needs, especially if they want to include different building styles or different needs or multi-generational units or something that would be more responsive to the urban Indian population than the urban population at large. We would like to encourage those sorts of collaborations.
I'm just taking it all in. It's so much. But no, I think no, I agree with you, Cynthia, because usually when we think of these communities, we always go to rural, and there's a whole different aspect of it that also needs to be addressed. So thank you for sharing that. Wow, this whole time we've been talking, I'm in that mindset, rural. So you just kind of like pull the however you say it over me, like I'm just oof, it just shocked me. So if any of our listeners were interested in learning more in depth about these programs, or who do I reach out to kind of access these grants, these resources, and all of this fun stuff, how do I coordinate a technical assistance with you guys? How could they reach you in your team?
Well, the Kansas State University has the National Tribal Tab program. We have many partners regionally that we work with, but we can help people contact the most appropriate people for their needs and their location. The way you can reach us most easily is to get online and go to our website. It's KSUTAB, that's KSUTAB.org/tribal. And we have a page there that has all the necessary contact information. And like I said, we're kind of air control. We will send you to the people that will be most appropriate. We have lots of partners that work for tribes. We have lots of expertise out there in Indian country. And we have lots of professors like me and Eugene who are more than happy to give assistance. So if you go to our website, especially if you call Scott Nightingale, who is our coordinator at KSU, he is a very wonderful person to talk to, and he will find the person that you need. And it's all free.
That last part is the most important part, right? Well, thank you guys so much. I feel refreshed because I feel like I learned so much. So I hope our listeners also learned as much as I did today. Eugene, Mark, any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners today?
Yeah, I would just like to encourage, if you are interested, if this has you geeking out a little bit, Tribal Tab really is a good resource for more information and training. And they do a lot of webinars, a lot of outreach to the tribes, and so that their calendar has a number of different events that might appeal to different people.
I'll plug the National Brownfields Conference if you really want to geek out on that in August in Oklahoma. And a lot of tribes are, this is the one that's closest to all the tribes. I'll also say that it although it's not easy to redevelop a brownfield, A journey of 1,000 miles starts with a few small steps.
Beautifully said. Oh my God, I love that last quote, Eugene. So that brings us to the end of yet another Hobokenga episode. We hope you enjoyed this episode. And as always, thank you for listening. If you enjoy the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And visit our website, www.nativelearningcenter.com, to find more information on upcoming webinars and virtual trainings. And be sure to come back for more content. We definitely have so much more interesting content coming up with these amazing people right here. So thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you, Mark, for yet another amazing episode.